Hello and welcome to part 2 of our material on language. Now, in the first part last week, I defined language for you in very general terms as a system of signs by which we communicate. But this week, we're going to be looking at the rest of the story. Okay? We're going to add a lot to that definition, because now we're going to be looking at language as a cultural adaptive tool. So we look at language in relation to culture and in relation to society, and we find that not only is language very important for communication generally, but language structures are very thought, what we pay attention to, what we select out of the world around us to label with words and to talk about in sentences. And as well, how we talk, our language usage, is always indicating, remember the idea of an index, something about who we are as a speaker, something about who we are as a member of society. So since the 1930s especially, and then again since the 1960s even more, and more, anthropological linguistics has emerged as an important field of study that helps us understand that we can study language as a window, almost literally, to a person's soul, but more importantly, or maybe more pragmatically, to a person's culture and to their social situation. All right, so let's get started. Here we are again looking at our layer cake model of language, which is the structuralist descriptivist model of language, where we study a language from the bottom up, from the sound system, through how words are formed, and then how sentences are formed, and then how discourse or connected text, conversation, communication entirely is structured. And you see semantics here as the icing on the cake, because at every level of this structure of language, which is a universal structure, all languages have the same structure basically, right? At every level of the structure, from sounds to words to sentences to text, there are meaningful units and relations between units. Okay? And anthropologists are very interested in language because they reflect the meanings that people construct through speaking or writing with language. So especially when you're looking at morphology, which is how words are formed, we learn a lot about a culture by looking at what they choose to pay attention to in their vocabulary and what don't they. For example, I'm going to give you an extended example of this down the road. As English speakers, think about it. We talk about events as if they occur in something we call time, right? We use what linguists call absolute tense, past, present, or future. The present is the moment of speaking, the past is before the moment of speaking, the future is after the moment of speaking. And we must obligatorily add certain endings to words, verbs usually, to indicate the tense. So for example, I would say, I walked yesterday, but I am walking now. I will walk tomorrow. And if I just say, I walk today, that's not accurate. All right? Well, maybe walk is, but you wouldn't just say, he walked today. You would have to add that S ending, he walks today. That is, we must indicate when our event takes place within our concept of time. And our concept of time, as coded by the tense system, right, is really culturally determined, believe it or not. Not all languages even have tense systems. And many languages have tense systems very different than our own. Japanese doesn't make a distinction between past and present. Hopi language is one I'm going to talk about in some detail on this subject. Hopis don't have a concept of past, present, and future at all. They have a totally different concept, which is unique to their culture. which I'll talk about later. So the very grammatical process of structuring our thoughts in a language reveals a lot about our culture, and we'll see later also our society. Now, one of the most fundamental ideas about the relationship between language and culture, and one that has been somewhat controversial in its history over time and has come back into favor more recently with the emergence of cognitive science and our understanding of how language works within the brain to filter our perceptions and to interpret our experience, is a notion first set forth in the 1930s in any kind of real form, and actually it was floating around before that in some other modes, by a man named Edward Sapir. Edward Sapir was an American linguist and anthropologist, one of the first linguistic anthropologists. Sapir was, as you see his picture here, he was writing in the 20s and 30s, really all the way up into at least the late 40s. I can't remember his death time, but we could look at that later. And he was a genius. He was one of the first students of Franz Boas, you remember Papa Boas, to get a degree in anthropology at Columbia University. And then he went on to Yale University, where he taught, also in Canada for a while. He started college when he was something like 13, graduated, with his PhD by the time he was like 17 or so. He was a true genius. And he was especially a genius in the area of languages. He advanced linguistics, certainly in America, more than any other individual ever has, before or since. And one of the things that he noted about language, more than Boas had even, was the relationship between language and psychology and society. He also performed the first comprehensive analysis, categorization, classification of all the languages, not only of North America, but of the entire world, in terms of typological structural principles of word formation and sentence structure. So, very deep thinker and a very, very prolific author on the subject of language. He wrote many grammars of Native American languages, complete grammars which are still in use today. Now, here's a statement then from Sapir on what has come to be known as the principle, and I won't say theory, the principle of linguistic relativity, which is associated with Sapir and with his student, Benjamin Whorf, who we'll look at next. Sapir says, and I know this one by heart, the worlds that people who speak different languages live in, the worlds that people speaking different languages live in, are distinct worlds, not merely the same world with different labels attached. Well, this is a breakthrough. This says language is like a filter between ourselves and the world. It's not that the world isn't out there in some objective way, structured in its own terms. But none of us perceive any real absolute structure of reality. All of us stamp onto the reality that we see around us or experience the categories and code of the language we speak. And that gives us a different perception, a different view of the world from one language to another. Where does that difference come from? Of course, from our cultures and from our societies. So let's look further. So folks, here's an excellent example from the Navajo language. And this comes from a book called Language and Art in the Navajo Universe by Gary Witherspoon, who grew up on the Navajo reservation and has a Navajo wife. Well, he realized something. He was a linguist as well, I believe he's still living, who learned something very interesting about Navajo language, especially in the syntax, which is how you form sentences in Navajo. Now, Noam Chomsky, whom you've probably heard of, who sort of revolutionized linguistics by giving us a way of studying syntax or sentence structure, right, in the 1960s. had this notion that although we sometimes transform sentences from such as active to passive, that when we do just those sorts of transformations, like I caught the, let me see, let me think of a good example here, folks. The dog ate the bone, or the bone was eaten by the dog. Active, passive. The dog ate the bone was eaten by the dog. In English, those active and passive constructions have the same meaning, right? Relatively speaking, anyway. They mean the same thing. They are meaning preserving, is what Chomsky would say. So this example from Navajo seems to be an exception to what Chomsky believed. And it's a very interesting window into Navajo culture. I used to teach at Arizona State University before I came to Colorado. And so I usually had Navajo-speaking students in my classes. And every time I would present this, it got a very interesting reaction from the Navajo students in class. So here are 3 sentences. 2 of them are good Navajo sentences, and the third one is not. The one with the asterisk in front of it is not a good Navajo sentence. The other 2 are. So look, and I haven't put all of the nasalization marks and tone marks, in case you speak Navajo, in this example. Hastin kli yistal. Hastin means man, kli means horse, yistal means kick or kicked, past or present, not distinguished. And the SO there means interpret the first, when you have the YI prefix, interpret the first noun to be the subject and the second noun to be the object. So it is the man, the horse, the man kicked the horse. Hastin kli yistal. Perfectly good Navajo sentence. Now let's go to the next sentence. Also a perfectly good Navajo sentence. Hastin, man, kli, still horse. Now just changing the prefix on the verb from yi to bi. Now it's bistal. Again, past or present doesn't matter. Now we're saying the man, the horse, read the first noun as the object and the second noun as the subject. And now it means the man, the horse, the man was kicked by the horse. That's okay to say in Navajo too. The man was kicked by the horse. Now notice in English that would be a passive statement, right? And the active version of the man was kicked by the horse in English would be what? Right, the horse kicked the man. Aha, there's the rub. When we look at the third sentence here, the third sentence written on the page, asterisk means ungrammatical. This next sentence is not only ungrammatical to Navajo, it's unthinkable to a first language pure Navajo monolingual speaker. I would usually ask students in my class who spoke Navajo and who could read it to read this next sentence out loud for class. And usually, if they agreed at all, they would look down, they would look up, they would laugh, or they would look away, but they refused to read this sentence. And I would say, why? Why don't you read this sentence? And they would say to me, well, it would sound like I don't know how to speak. It would sound like I'm a baby who hasn't learned how to talk properly, or like an Anglo trying to speak Navajo, which is worse, right? Okay. Kli, horse. Hastin, man. Yistal, first noun subject, second noun object, kick or kicked. We would think it would mean the horse, the man. The horse kicked the man, in that order. Guess what, folks? That is improper, grammatically incorrect, syntactically wrong, unthinkable, unspeakable in Navajo. Why can you not say the horse kicked the man? Think about it for a minute. You can say the man was kicked by the horse, but you cannot say the horse kicked the man. Well, here's the deal. It's cultural. The Navajo language and the use of it reflects what's called a chain of being scale, or an animacy hierarchy in the language that reflects cultural ideas about beings in the world. Who can act on whom, or what can act on what in terms of beings. There's a whole scale that says two-leggeds, humans, can be the active agent affecting a four-legged creature, but that four-legged creature cannot directly serve as the agent that affects the human. On the other hand, horses are higher on that scale than some smaller four-legged animals. Four-legged animals are higher than plants. Plants are higher than minerals. And actually, some natural forces like lightning are higher than humans. So if I say lightning struck the man, I would mean that literally. Lightning as an agent, as an acting subject, spotted that particular guy and zapped him. All right, agentively we say. So the problem with Lee Hastinius Tal is that you're giving too much agency to the horse. A horse cannot act on a man as the subject of a transitive sentence. How about that? So here we see the effect of culture, even in syntax. And we learn a lot about Navajo culture. And you can think back of the film about the Navajo that you saw, right? The proper relationship between all beings. You see, for the Navajo, and maybe for any of you who've grown up around horses, what's the first thing you learn as a human being, if you grow up around horses, right? You don't stand behind a horse, you might get kicked. So when they say Hastin Klibis Tal, the man was kicked by the horse, what they really mean is that man let himself get kicked. He should have known better. Humans should have a higher intelligence, or what's called volition, control, the ability to control their actions and to anticipate the outcomes, than horses. It's not the horse's fault, it's the man's. Let's move on. So now, Benjamin Lee Whorf was in part a student of Edward Sapir at Yale University, but actually Whorf was also a genius, really, looking at language. He grew up as a self-taught linguist before he ever met Sapir. And he actually had a PhD in chemistry and worked as a fire insurance salesman. And during that time, he took a class from Sapir at Yale University and became fascinated and started working together with Sapir on this angle of this relationship between a language and a culture. Now, Whorf was actually the linguist that most interested me first, and is really why I started studying linguistics, was from reading a book, a posthumously edited book called Language, Thought, and Reality, edited by John B. Carroll, which was a set of articles written by Whorf, who never really published more than just a couple of articles before an early death from cancer in his early 40s. Now, he advanced our notion, though, of this relationship between thought and culture and language really more than anyone else had before or since. Okay. So he wrote several articles. One was called The Relation Between Habitual Thought and Behavior and Language, which came to be highly associated with this notion that Sapir's also connected with, of this principle of linguistic relativity. Now, to Whorf, when he talked about relativity in terms of language, he was coming directly and soon after Einstein, whose idea of general relativity is that the world appears differently according to the observer. Well, this is what Whorf meant by linguistic relativity. The world looks differently according to the language of the observer. And he had many, many good examples of this, and I really recommend that book, Language, Thought, and Reality. From the most simple observations that he made as a fire insurance salesman, for instance, when he noted that there was a fire that took place where some workers were near an empty vat, and that's how they described it. And so because it was empty, they flicked their cigarette butts in the vicinity of the vat. And guess what? It blew up because it had been filled with a noxious gaseous substance. And so even though the fluid was no longer there, there was still a residue from the noxious substance, which caused the inflammation. So he said that the way that the workers were thinking about the vat in terms of language, that it was empty, influence their behavior. And he became fascinated with this. More importantly, Whorf became interested in cross-cultural, cross-linguistic patterns of language because he understood that it represented different ways of perceiving and analyzing the world altogether, right? Like Sapir had said, that speakers of different language are living in different worlds, okay? So he, especially as a scientist, thought, if we want to understand science in a much broader framework than simply Western science, right? We need to look at how different languages analyze the world in terms of categories and thought patterns and constructions. If we think of science as a way of knowing, then language provides that way of knowing for us. So, for instance, for myself, I've always been fascinated by quantum physics, and I've studied a lot of it. I watch everything on TV about it. And I've always been curious about why is it that Americans have hardly grasped some of Einstein's most basic principles and some basic principles of quantum physics since then. We find it very difficult to talk about the fact that, for example, all of matter is made up of these atoms where the nucleus is really tiny, and the distance between a nucleus and just the electron in an atom is like the distance between where I'm sitting here at my desk and, you know, China, right? Most of reality is essentially empty space, and yet it's very, or we might say fields is really more accurate, right? But it's very difficult for us to wrap our heads around that because, let's say English, for instance, has us look at things as if they are solid. And when we name a noun as a thing, we can touch it, we can feel it, right? We think it's solid. Now, different languages have different ways of describing reality, and sometimes quite distinctively different than English. So anyway, before showing you some of these examples from Whorf, it's come down, as I said, as a sort of controversial back and forth discussion about how much is this true? To what degree does language influence our perceptions and our experience in reality? It's a very important question, because if it's not a very big difference, then under the surface all languages are really identical on some deep level. Whereas if it does make a difference, then our language, through our mind, through our cognition, fundamentally shapes the way we perceive the world and bends reality to our culture and our society's expectations and norms, which I believe as a linguistic anthropologist is the case. So there have been two versions of this that have developed over time, and not just in linguistics, but in philosophy and psychology and many other social science fields. The first is sometimes known as the strong version, although neither of these are named as such by Sapir or Whorf or others. The strong so-called version of the theory of the Whorf-Sapir hypothesis, okay, is known more accurately as linguistic determinism. Linguistic determinism, which is much refuted, and I would refute it too, is this notion that language sort of randomly somehow develops, and once it has developed, then it determines how we think, it shapes our culture, and it then determines our behavior. Language determines thought, determines behavior. This is a deterministic view that pretty much says we're prisoners of our language. Now, we all know, any one of you who has spoken more than one language in your lifetime, right? If you've been fluent in more than one language, I certainly have, and many of you I know have as well. You know that you can learn another language, right? And there's rough translation. There are problems with translation from language to language, which Whorf would point out, by the way. But we can learn another language and then use that as another filter to look at the world, okay? So there's more flexibility and plasticity in the human mind. And the other problem with that formulation, this linguistic determinism point of view, tends to start with this notion that how language forms in the first place is somehow random and chaotic. You know, we just happen to choose this set of sounds instead of that set of sounds. But as an anthropologist, I know that that cannot possibly be the case. Our cultural experience determines our need for communication, and we talk about that which is relevant to our cultural and social experience. So now let's look at the other point of view, which is closer to an anthropological linguistic point of view. It has been named by a psychologist as the, quote, weak version, but it's the version that anthropological linguists hold. And this is the notion of linguistic relativity. And it's not thought of as a theory, it's a fact, it's a principle of linguistic relativity. And here you see all these arrows between language, thought, culture, and behavior, all intersecting with one another. All of these dimensions of human experience mutually influence each other. Also then, as culture or society changes, so does language and so does behavior. Sapir did point out that language would change less quickly than culture. It takes time for language to catch up with cultural changes. All right? But these three go hand in glove. And so this is the principle of linguistic relativity, that language, thought, behavior, culture are all closely interconnected and interwoven. As one changes, so do the rest. Okay? So here's from that book, Language, Thought, and Behavior, again edited by John Carroll, the selected works of Benjamin Lee Whorf, which is the first linguistics book I ever read when I was a junior in college, undergraduate, and I fell in love with it, and that's what led me in the direction of linguistics. So in this very famous article by Whorf, The Relation Between Habitual Thought and Behavior and Language, I invite you to go look it up or ask me for a copy, I'll send you one. He pays a special attention to the difference between two very differently structured languages, which are English and Hopi. Now remember, I studied at Zuni, Pueblo, and Hopi is another Pueblo Indian culture, very closely related culturally to Zuni, although not linguistically, they're very different languages, but they share very similar cultures. So Hopi, being a Native American language, is very, very different than English and has certainly no connection to history of English whatsoever. It's not an Indo-European language, obviously. It's an Amerindian language, we might say. So now here's the statement that he makes about Hopi. He says the grammar of Hopi bears a relation to Hopi culture, where the grammar of European tongues such as English bears a relation to our cultural history, beliefs, customs, social structure. And here's a really provocative statement of his. Newton, right, Isaac Newton, Newtonian space, time, and matter, he says, are no intuitions. They are recepts from culture and language, and that is where Newton got them. In other words, the very concept of gravity, for instance, that Newton proposed, right, are framed in terms of English language. And so we talk about objects falling through space and landing. And yet, interestingly enough, Whorf says that is not a universally shared observation or perception or reality. So let's look a little closer at how he makes this. So I've created this particular diagram based on 3 or 4 of Whorf's articles about the Hopi language. And the most important difference between how Hopis talk about and thereby think about the world and how an English speaker does, Whorf would refer to English as one of the standard average European languages, SAE. Big difference between Hopi and SAE is that SAE, English for instance, has this absolute tense system I talked about a little bit ago. The moment of speaking is the present, after the moment of speaking is the future, before the moment of speaking, past. This creates a linear concept of time for the English speaker. It encodes or frames events relative to this linear sequence, which is really an imaginary sequence. Think about it. When was the last time you held a minute in your hand, right? Or carded a an hour from one place to another. These are imaginary concepts. Time exists only in relation to spatial parameters, right? We call it time-space. That's what Einstein called it. He didn't distinguish time and space, but talked about time-space. Well, guess what? So do the Hopis. Rather than having this absolute tense system, past, present, and future, Hopi language has none of those. Instead, it makes a primary distinction through what's called, what Worf translated as, the realm of the manifest, that which is existing now in the present moment, and the realm of everything that's not present in the present moment, which he described as the not manifest. He also called these objective and subjective, that what's in the present moment is objective, and what is anything else is subjective. Well, this is fascinating. Think about it. Anything happening right now in the moment of speaking is their manifest. And they would code these linguistically, just like we have to put the S or the ED ending, okay, on our verbs. Something that maybe existed 10 minutes ago but no longer exists is in the realm of the not manifest. I also think of this as the latent and the manifest. Something that exists, that may come into existence tomorrow or may never come into existence at all, folks, is in that same realm of the unmanifest. And something that existed mythologically and is thought of as having existed in the distant primordial past in the time of creation is in that same realm of the unmanifest. So this unmanifest realm is huge. And this manifest realm that's happening right now is in the moment only. Because of this, Hopis think in terms of preparing in their minds to bring into manifestation that which is good, positive, harmonious. The very word Hopi means basically harmonious. And they have another word, Kahopi. Guess what that means? Not harmonious, not in harmony. If someone is ill, this will be interesting for you nursing and pre-med students. If someone is having symptoms of illness, they will often call a Hopi medical practitioner, right? Medicine man, we say. And one of the first things the medicine man is going to ask about is, why are you thinking bad thoughts about yourself? Why are you manifesting illness? Think positive, good thoughts, and manifest health. So they have this strong belief that through the power of the mind and imagination, we can create the reality we choose. How about that? That sounds very metaphysical, doesn't it? And many people have commented on Hopi language that it embeds many metaphysical principles. Interesting to Benjamin Worf, because he was also, by the way, right, someone who believed in theosophy. And he would give, some of his best talks were given at Theosophical Society meetings about language and mind and reality. Okay. So the greater part of this diagram I've shown here shows that when you really analyze Hopi language, it's more complex than just those two. In the manifest realm, happening right now, you also have to distinguish with your grammar whether something is existing by your direct observation or by hearsay, by the kind of evidence you have. You have to make that distinction. There's a ceremony going on at the top of Wallapai Mesa, or because I'm here right now and I'm reporting it, or I hear that there is that going on, but I'm not sure because I'm not there right now. Compared to in the realm of this unmanifest, here's an interesting story from Hopi. Every few years, there are priests at Hopi, and they have the Kachina religion, right? That's the Hopi religion. The priests are to make a pilgrimage on foot every few years to the Grand Canyon. Now, Hopi is in northeastern Arizona, and that's some several hundred miles away at least. And it'll be take them several days, and they'll walk to the Grand Canyon. They'll go to a particular place which is secret to them in the Grand Canyon, known as their Sipapu. which is their place of emergence. They believe that Hopis lived in three underground regions, really one at a time, and that each time when discord arose, then they would climb up to the next level of reality, and so they're on the fourth world now. And when they came up through that hole onto the earth for the first time, they call that their sipapu. We call it sometimes their earth navel. N-A-V-A-L. I'm sorry, N-A-V-E-L, right? So every few years, the priests make a pilgrimage to this sipapu place, where they plant prayer feathers and they perform certain prayers and rituals at that center place of all creation in their world. And then they walk back. Now, in the alternate years when they can't walk to the Grand Canyon, the same group of priests, order of priests, sits in the kivas, which is a religious place for them, and they close their eyes and they practice certain customs that opens their inner eye, and they visually, imagistically, imaginatively, we would think, travel and traverse that space-time to the sipapu. They go through the entire route within their mind, and they use their mind's eye. They go entirely there. They believe that they leave their body through the soft spot in the top of their head, and in soul or spirit form, they travel to the Grand Canyon. Once there, they gather there, they sing their songs, they plant their prayer feathers, they do their rituals, and then they come back. And this may take quite a bit of time, but certainly not the same number of days it would take to walk there physically. Now, they believe, and they will tell you, that when they make the pilgrimage through the realm of the unmanifest to the Grand Canyon, it is just as real and just as effective as doing it physically. There's no distinction in their minds. Now, I ask you, isn't this a very different understanding of how we relate to and move through reality? So when you really look at the adverbial elements, what's called the aspectual, like we have aspects in English, I will have been doing something, I had finished, right? Those are aspect rather than tense. For in the Hopi language, then, they have these adverbial qualifiers for the manifest or the not manifest that actually distinguished 4 stages of manifestation. And it relates for them like to the growing of corn. You plant the seed in the ground, and it's in this latent area, this latent potential area deep in the ground, waiting for the moisture, waiting to grow and germinate. And then there's an inceptive aspect. Something is beginning to come into being, but it's not yet fully formed. And then there's this evident, again, I see it, it's evident to me, aspect. Now it's fully formed and I can see it by direct observation. And then it is receding. It's going back into the realm of the unmanifest. It's still slightly apparent, but it's going back into the realm of the unmanifest. When you think about it, this is a cyclical view of experience. I won't even call it time. To them, it's a process. So to the Hopis, they have this cyclical view of life. They believe in reincarnation, folks. All right? Life after life after life. And their view of what we call time is cyclical. And isn't that interesting? Because they are a horticultural people who depend a lot on the cycle of the seasons. Okay? So that shows a very, very definite relationship between Hopi language and Hopi culture, which is very different than our concept of time. Now, for us, for example, we wear a watch. We have a clock on the wall. We clock in and we clock out, right? At work, for instance. And we measure our lives in terms of what seem to be discrete segments of time to us. To Worf, he says he compares that to like beads on a necklace, where one bead is just like the next. But it's an artificial, imaginary set of perceptions that simply fits within our fast-paced world, where we measure units of work, for instance, right? In terms of time. Well, I'll leave you to read this for yourself. This is Worf's statement on the historical implications of the linguistic relativity principle, and is a very deep statement. In the end, let me just read the last sentence. He says, language represents mass mind, in other words, collective thought. It is affected by inventions and innovations, but only little and slowly, whereas to inventors and innovators, right, it brings new things into manifestation. It creates and legislates, it says, or creates something new which was never even perceived before. This is because, look further in the statement here, language is a system, and it's a system not just of words, but it organizes our thoughts, frames our perceptions. So if we frame a new set of perceptions, we frame new way of talking about something like quantum physics does, this can reshape our entire understanding of reality. How about that? Well, like his mentor, Edward Sapir, Worf died at an early age, also in his 40s, also of cancer. And it was after his death that linguistic anthropology emerged full form. And the early stage of it we would call language and culture studies. This is when usually psychologists and anthropological linguists trained in anthropology also, work together to try to explore to what degree does this principle of linguistic relativity affect culture. And so these tended to be comparisons of languages, comparisons of cultures. One of the early studies was this one I've represented here as a triads, TRIADS study. Very simple psychological test, right? Lenneberg and Roberts were the psychologist and the linguist who looked at this. And they took two languages that were different in certain structural ways, Navajo and English. Now, Navajo is famous. Oh, you remember, you know perhaps that in World War II, the Navajo code talkers were very important because they used Navajo language, and the Japanese could never decode what they were saying. Japanese language is very complex when it comes to shape features, and it's obligatory that they make all these distinctions of shape and quality, and whether something is large or small, round or oval or narrow or wide, all these different shape factors that get loaded onto the nouns and actually in the verbs as well about the nouns. So they make a lot of shape distinctions, more than we do, whereas Navajo language does not distinguish between blue and green, even to this day. There's one word. We can think of it as GRUE, G-R-U-E. They don't distinguish green and blue. We'll come to that a little bit later as to why that is. Whereas, of course, English speakers distinguish more colors than Navajo language does. So there was this triad study set up an experiment to see, would monolingual Navajo kids group things more by shape, and Anglo kids group things more by color rather than shape. So they would do this test with several objects. So, for example, they would give these 5-year-old kids who are monolingual in Navajo or English, they would give them first a yellow stick and then a blue rope, you see? And then they give them a third thing. Which one of the, which is this more like? Is it more like the yellow stick, the yellow rope, grouping by color? Or is it more like the rope, the yellow rope with the blue rope, grouping by shape? And interestingly enough, their hypothesis was, of course, that Navajo kids would group by shape and Anglo kids would group by color instead, more frequently. And their study bore out very nicely, statistically. Almost entirely. The Navajo kids tended to group by shape, the Anglo kids grouped by color, but There was one group of kindergartners in Boston who were Anglo-English speakers, and they grouped in the majority more by shape than by color, which is very interesting. So they asked the teacher, why do you think this is? Why did your group behave differently than the other 5-year-olds around the country? And what do you think she said? Well, first of all, she was not Navajo. She was not teaching these kids in some kind of Navajo way. But what was going on was that she says, well, of course, just this last week I gave them a module on shape. And so that's why they were more attuned to that distinction at this time. So that's interesting too, because it again reaffirms this linguistic relativity principle. The language that we speak predisposes us to view the world through the structure or framework of that language, the grammar of that language. But it also affirms that we're not talking about linguistic determinism. We can learn new concepts, we can learn about another language, we can learn another way of thinking about the world, and then apply those new principles. Our minds are more plastic than that. Okay? But this was one of the early studies that definitely reinforced this principle of linguistics. There was another very famous study of this nature. And by the way, we call this early language and culture period. Sometimes we refer to it as, in broad terms, ethnoscience. Folk, ethno, science, classification. How people in different cultures classify their world through language. So another major study that was done, and very interesting follow-ups occurred after this, were by Brent Berlin and Paul Kay, again a psychologist and a linguistic anthropologist. And Paul Kay and Brent Berlin wrote a book well known now called Basic Color Terms: Their Universality and Evolution in 1969. And they looked at color terminology. A lot of these studies looked at realms of cultural experience or human experience that appear to be basically universal, and then looked to see what does language do in relation to those human universals. Is it the same from language to language? So we all perceive color, obviously. We all live in a world with color, and unless you're colorblind, you might perceive colors differently, but most of us, as long as we have rods and cones, perceive a world infused with color. So they did a study to see, would languages code color similarly or differently around the world? And they came up with some very interesting results. Not just one result, but several. One of the most important results, though, was that guess what? Different languages do not encode color the same way. In fact, there are some languages in this world where there are only 2 words for colors that are distinctly color words, and sometimes not even an overall cover term for color. And in every place where you have a 2 color term system in the vocabulary, it's always the same 2 range of colors: dark and bright, or black and white. And so when you ask a Papua New Guinea person to look at the 152 or so color chips on the Munsell color chart and to say, what would you call this, what would you call that in terms of color, for about half of the chips they'll say one term, and for the other half they'll say another. And they won't distinguish all the gradations in between as colors. Some languages encode 3 colors, and it's always the same 3rd color: red. Well, it's probably not because of fire or blood, as you might think, because those existed in our understanding, long before that. But it probably is perceptually because red is the most saturated range of colors. Red, reddish, warm colors have very high hue, saturation, and brightness. So black and white, and then distinguishing red. And they found, when they compared all the languages of the world that they looked at, right, that there's a distinct evolution of color terminology in the vocabularies of these languages over time. But it's more than that, so that in our state-level society, when we think of the basic color terms, that means where the word is only referring to a color, like green, right? And it's usually monosyllabic, only one syllable. Green, blue, red, okay? There are 11 of these that we have, and then we have all sorts of shades of all of these. But there are 11 basic color terms in our language, and guess what? That is the highest number of basic color terms, and that's found in many parts of the world, always in states like we live in. A little tiny little statement they made in this basic color terminology book that not everybody even finds. You have to go looking for it to find it there. There's a little comment they made where they compared the level of sociocultural complexity, like band, tribe, chieftain, state, remember from early in the semester, and number of color terms. And guess what? The simpler the society, the fewer color terms. The more complex the society, the more basic color terms. I think what this represents is that in a highly differentiated, stratified social system like our state, we have a stratified hierarchy, a stratified taxonomy of any vocabulary domain, including color. Interestingly enough, there was a linguistic anthropologist and actually a psychological linguist named David Lancy, who went to Papua New Guinea to study all this. Long story short, when he gave Papua New Guineans photographs of just things in their environment, trees and plants and homes and everything else, spoons or whatever, he would ask them to group these pictures just in relevant categories of things. And they were able to sort that in like many, many different ways. These are good for eating, these are not. These are good for medicine, these are not. They think in terms of what he called pairing, or twos, T-W-O. Male, female, young, old. Their basic classification system about the world was in terms of this pairing, these dyadic relations. Whereas when he asked them to talk about, what kinds of plants are there, what kinds of trees, and they live in a very forested environment, they would hardly ever give him any deep taxonomy. He could never get more than a 2-level taxonomy. Well, those are good eating bushes, and those are not. And so where they don't have a deep taxonomy, they do have this pairing relation. And guess what? Their entire society is based on pairing. Masculine, feminine, older, younger, is the basis of their egalitarian hunter-gathering society. Whereas in our stratified, centralized society, right, our vocabulary, such as our Linnaean system of classification in Western science, right, is centralized and stratified just like our society. So there's a mirroring here between the kind of social organization and the language. Let's move on. Now in the 1970s or so, these early ideas of ethnoscience, which I've only given you the very surface of, emerged into another mode of linguistic anthropology, looking at language and culture, called the ethnography of speaking. And there's one particular linguistic anthropologist, also really a genius in his own way, Del Hymes, who wrote about this along with John Gumpertz, who was a sociologist. So here was a teaming up of an anthropological linguist and a sociologist. What they paid attention to as a way that we can use language as a window on culture is communication itself, and how we use language reflects what they called speech events or communicative events. For example, you walk into a classroom setting, your teacher walks in, right, and immediately the conversation in the room between the teacher and the students, and even the students and each other, unless they're close friends, tends to be a kind of high technical language that they're using that relates to the subject they're studying. Okay, a very formal, educated discourse. But then those students, or even that professor, right, leaves the classroom, goes home to their family, and speaks in a much more casual way. Well, now here's an important point. I said that I would be changing the definition of language with this part too. And here's the first place for me to do that. A language is not one way of talking about reality. And it is not true that everybody who speaks the same language speaks the language in the same way at any given time. Even the same speaker may speak the language differently at different times of the day. And certainly when it comes to any kind of social distinctions, by gender, by ethnicity, sometimes religion, any social difference can cause a different variety of language to be spoken regionally, right? The deep South versus the Midwest, right? Boston versus New York City. We're going to look at one of those examples later. So that in reality, we have to say a language is a system of ways of speaking, not one way of speaking. We'll come back to that in a formal definition later. For now, that relates to this idea of ethnography of communication or ethnography of speaking that Del Hymes and John Gumpertz promoted. They said, we can study how people communicate in terms of these factors they called components of speech events. The kind of event you're in, they're saying, affects how you're going to speak within that situation. So speech event affects speech acts that take place within that event. And this is all very culturally organized. So if we're looking at any cultural event or communicative event within culture, we can look at these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 components, which they've organized in this anagram, speaking, S-P-E-A-K-I-N-G. You have to pay attention to what is the setting and the scene. You know, what kind of situation are you dealing with? What kind of participants are involved as culturally coded, such as the teacher and the students, or the addressor and the addressee, the speaker and the person they're speaking to, or by clan, or by class, or by caste, or by gender, right? Those are types of participants. What are the ends, and this is the goals that they're aiming their conversation to, or their communication to. They might have a different goal in the classroom than they have, you know, playing tennis together. So that's going to affect how they communicate. The act sequence, for A, which is just, you know, who speaks first? Is there turn taking going on? Does the young person speak first and the older speaker respond? That kind of thing. Is there a structure to turn taking behavior? K for keys. And that tone, manner, spirit, you know, what kind of, is it a casual tone or a very formal tone? Is it imperialistic, you know, like a very imperial tone, or a fun, humorous tone? Okay. And that might be partly determined by the situation as well. I, for instrumentalities, if there are more than one language involved in the speech community, you know, like Spanish and English, do they switch channels? Do they code switch between Spanish and English, right? When does a Spanish speaker from Mexico, let's say, use English, and when does he use Spanish, and when does he mix those, and how, and what are the situations that influence that? And for norms, cultural norms, expectations, right? When is it proper to speak or not speak, for instance? And I think I had you read an article this week that will relate to that, and I'll talk about that very, very soon. And genres for G. Stylistic forms, you know, is it academic text, or is it a cartoon, right? Is it spoken, or is it written, or, you know, or is it just visual, right? Cues, okay, or even ASL, all right? So taking all these things into account, if you can describe a cultural communicative situation by paying attention to these factors. And that's one of the reasons I had you read, this should be one of the articles you read this week, Silence Among the Western Apache. So let's take a look at that. The author, Keith Basso, of that article, Silence Among the Western Apache, was a direct student of Del Hymes. And actually his article is an application of this ethnography of communication approach. So if you've read this article, which is a fun article to read, just go look at it. To Give Up on Words, Silence in Western Apache Culture. Keith Basso spent time on the Sibique Apache Reservation in Arizona. many years, and he became very, very proficient in understanding their language as well as their culture. He was a linguistic anthropologist, taught at the University of Arizona for many years. And one of the things he observed many times in many different ways was how there were occasions in Navajo cultural experience where you should not speak. And that's what this article is about, directly. And if you read it, you'll see there's several very interesting scenarios where a Western Apache person, and by the way, Navajo share a very similar set of customs, and Navajo language and Apache language are very closely interconnected. Okay. For example, he gives the example of someone who goes off to boarding school, a child who is sent off to boarding school, which of course is where English is spoken. When the child comes back at Christmas or summer, he observed that sometimes parents would not speak to their kids for days. They wouldn't greet them with lots of talk, and the kids respectfully would tend to be quiet too for a few days. And then, unless, at the point where the child started showing, they started chopping wood or doing something for their grandmother or grandfather, that's when the parents would start talking to the child again. And when Basso asked them about that, they would say, well, we want to make sure he's still Apache. Is he ashamed of being Apache? Is he ashamed of speaking Apache language because he spent all that time with Anglos speaking English? Another interesting case was courtship, right? If you read the article. A young Apache woman and man may meet each other many, many times without never even as much as hand-holding and hardly speaking. Maybe a young Apache boy may show up at a girl's house and they might, say hello, and that's about it. They may go off to a movie, watch the movie together, not even holding hands. Come back after the movie, goodbye, see ya. Oh, which means yes, see ya. Oh, yes. And this may go on for months. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, things are happening. The woman's mother is checking out the boy's family, making sure he's of an appropriate clan, because in Navajo, you cannot marry into your mother's clan, your father's mother's clan, your father's clan, or your father's mother's clan. Remember our kinship discussion? All those people are like close kin to you, and you couldn't marry them. They're to us like brother and sister. So first she's checking out that he's of an appropriate clan, that it's okay for the girl to be dating him in a romantic way. And eventually, at some point, the mother will let the daughter know it's okay. He's a good boy. It's okay for you to be dating him. And now they might just start chatting up a storm the next time they get together. How different is that than us, right? We meet romantic potential for the first time. We might tell them all about ourselves. We go home and we think, oh my gosh, I said so much, they'll never want to talk to me again, right? Totally opposite in how we approach relationships. Or a drunk Apache, right? Keith Basso says, never talk to a drunk Apache. Now, I spent 14 years in Arizona, and I can tell you this is a commonly known rule of thumb in going into a bar or a restaurant where there might be a drunk Apache. Everybody knows you don't talk to a drunk Apache. Why? Because they are not responsible for their actions. Alcohol may make them do something in their understanding, right, that they wouldn't have otherwise done. Or an angry Apache. You don't talk to an angry Apache person because the anger might stir them to violence, and they're not responsible in a way for their behavior. So it's kind of like you don't stand behind a horse, you get kicked, right? You don't talk to a drunk Apache, you might get injured. Okay, that's a culturally normative idea on the Apache reservation and in areas with a lot of Apache people. Okay, so here on this slide it shows you what Basso found was sort of the underlying principles of all these taboos about not using language for Apaches. So he says it's associated with social situations where the status between people is ambiguous, where that is where there's unfamiliarity. You don't know this person yet. You don't know what their intentions are. You don't know if they're a good person or not a good person, like a witch, we might say. And Predictability. These are situations where the behavior is unpredictable. If someone is drunk or angry, their behavior may be unpredictable. And his third point here, keeping silent among the Western Apache is a response to uncertainty and unpredictability in social relations. There's a story about an anthropologist named Clyde Cluckone, who wrote a book called The Navajo, one of the first books in anthropology about the Navajo, and in the 1940s. So he was introduced by a friend to a Navajo man when he first went there to study. And this man, this Hastine, was going to his home, his hogan. So the anthropologist followed along. Well, the man gave him a cup of coffee, didn't even look at him in the eye, handed him a cup of coffee, went about his business. And for a couple of hours, Cluckone is just sitting in this man's hogan, and this guy's not speaking to him at all. He's getting pretty, the American, the Anglo, is getting pretty upset by all this, right? And he's thinking, oh my God, why am I here? They're never going to talk to me. They hate me. I might as well go home. So eventually he excuses himself and he leaves. And he doesn't know how to deal with this situation. He's thinking about it for days. And he happens to be in a trading post on the reservation a few days later when this same Hastine walks in. And sure enough, all of a sudden, believe it or not, this man starts talking to Clyde Cluckone in English, just talking up a storm. How you been? Gee, my wife and this and that and the other. What was going on? Well, between the time that he had seen this man at his home and the trading post, he'd learned more about who this man was, what he was about, why he was there. He'd become more familiar to him, and he felt he could trust him. Okay? So that's a part of how Navajos and Apaches don't use language, right? They're much more conservative about it, much more reserved than we are. But think about it. When we walk onto an elevator, right? Let's say you're chatting up a storm with your best buddy on campus here at UCCS, right? You're chatting up a storm, all the latest scoop, all the gossip. You walk on an elevator in Main Hall on campus, and on the second floor, the chancellor gets on, right? What happens? Total silence, right? You avert your eye contact. You don't even look at each other. You look on the floor. You wait until she gets off the elevator, and then what? You start up chatting again. That also shows that in our culture, perhaps the use of language is somewhat framed and coded by power distinctions or hierarchy. This person of very high status gets on the elevator, and you go into sudden muteness. Isn't that funny? That's part of our culture. Okay then, so this brings us to sociolinguistics, which now looks at the relationship between the use of language and society or social structure, social organization. Here we look at language, not one language versus another, but we look at the internal variation within a speech community. A speech community, then, is a group of people who understand each other's speech, although they may speak very different dialects from one another. Okay. In fact, a speech community can also include people who don't understand each other's speech, but they still live within the same society, and they recognize one language or another within that society, like Spanish in America, right, as part of that overall mix of languages that has its own sort of mainstream status or at the same time local status as well. So now we look at how language and the use of language indicates, indexicalizes social differences and shared versus not shared communities. And this is where sociolinguistics becomes really big. So here you see a definition for sociolinguistics, the study of the effect of aspects of society, including cultural norms and expectations and context or the situation, on how language is used. All right, let's look at some interesting examples. You can have fun with this cartoon on your own. So here I'm giving you a new definition of what language is. I said I would turn the definition from last week on its head this week, and here is what I'm doing with that. So now let's look at this new definition of language that's going to bring a sociolinguistic perspective into view. So now we can say language is a socially ranked or stratified system of linguistic varieties, ways of speaking. For example, dialects, registers, what we call codes. I'll show you some of that. The use of which reflects the social, political, and economic structure of and values and cultural values and beliefs of members of a speech community. So it's a socially ranked system of language varieties. Every language is a system of varieties, a system of dialects, registers, codes, not one way of speaking. And it's the variation within how we speak the language that encodes or indexicalizes all these social factors. All right, so think about this, not only in general, but in your own life as well. Here's an example then from Clifford Geertz's book called Religion in Java, where he looks not only at the culture in Java, but also, and the religion, but also the language. So here he's looking at how people in Java might say the same sentence depending on their social level in society. Java has quite a mixture of some Hindu people, some Islamic peoples, and some indigenous native peoples. And they each speak different dialects of Javanese. So if you are a high Brahmin caste person in Java speaking to another high, same level, high Brahmin caste, you would say, in order to say, are you going to eat rice and cassava now? And I'm sure I'm going to butcher the language, but you'll say something like, Menapa panjening gambari dahra seko kalijan kaspi samanika. But now notice on the bottom of this chart, if you are from a low-ranking, working class, indigenous, non-status person talking to someone in your own low rank in Javanese society, you would ask that same question this way. And notice there's only one word between these two different sentences that is even the same, and that is kaspe, cassava, which might even be a borrowed-in term. Wow! Talk about stratification and polarization by social differences. People in these two different ethnic groups represented by 3A and 1 on the chart live in different worlds. They speak different languages, but it's even the same language. If you've ever studied any Japanese, I don't know if some of you have, you would know that Japanese also has a lot of dialect variation based on social difference. So if you're a man speaking to a woman, or a woman speaking to a man, or a man speaking to a man, or a woman speaking to a woman, or someone high ranked versus to someone low ranked, someone who's a freshman in college versus a senior in college, or a student and a teacher, etc., you would have to vary and put in all these extra words in the language and extra endings of verbs and things like this to indexicalize, remember, your social status in relation to the person you're talking to. One example from Japanese is a sentence final form yo, Y-O. All right, it's called a sentence click. It ends the sentence. If a man were to say in Japanese what translates like, so let's go to dinner, yo, it means, so let's go to dinner, and you better believe it, let's go. If a woman says the same sentence, so let's go to dinner, but says yo, guess what? Because she's a woman saying it, she's saying, so let's go to dinner, don't you think? Would that be okay? She's hedging. All right. And by the way, gender affects communication styles quite a lot. Not because of any biological differences between males and females, but because of socialization. I think I'm going to show you one example of that later on. So, how we speak language is indicative of social relationships, power structures, and all these things. It becomes almost pernicious. Let's say you spoke African American English because you grew up in an inner city in Chicago or somewhere, and Black English was the dialect of your environment, of your world. By the way, Black English is a perfectly good dialect of English. It has its own rules. And it comes from when African Americans were brought over as slaves, and on the slave ships, they developed this pidgin-like language to adapt to English, which then became a Creole taught to generations over time. All right? If you spoke African American English growing up and then you went for a job interview with a big financial company or something, well, you'd have to think about, how you're going to talk to this potential employer. Now, if this potential employer were also African American, well, maybe it would be okay for you to speak with each other in that mode. If this were, a white upper class guy, looked like, he's very strict and speaking very formal English to you, well, you're probably going to have to adapt your speech to speak standard English, right? And if you don't, you may be disempowered. You may be stigmatized against. You may not get that job. So how we use language really matters in face-to-face interaction within society. By the way, when you go home from that job interview and you go back to your family, you want to switch back into the local vernacular, right? You want to switch back into African American English, or you're going to be looked at, like as someone who's dissing, your own people, right? Very interesting stuff, and we hardly ever think about it, but we use language all the time to discriminate against people or to show our social solidarity with our own groups or families. Well, I'm going to move a little closer to the camera right now because this time of day the sunshine's coming in and creating a lot of glare, I think, in the video. So now I want to talk a little further about these dialects and how we look at this with sociolinguistics. And particularly, there's an interesting study done by William Labov on stratification of society and how that shows up in the use of language, particularly in New York City. Now, William Labov was one of the first sociolinguists, and his dissertation study was about African American English in New York City. And he was one of the first to help us understand that African American English is, in fact, a well-formed dialect with its own rules, its own tenses, and things like this. And I'm going to show you some information about that a little bit later, too. But for now, I want to talk about this study he did about one particular feature of New York City dialect. In sociolinguistics, instead of looking at how whole languages compare with each other, we're zooming in and looking at, specific features that serve as indexes of social differences within a language group. So he looked at one particular feature of New York City dialect, which he called the dropping of the R-less feature. For example, you might say in New York City, for G-U-A-R-D, God. For C-A-R, ka, right? And living in the city, you wouldn't notice any difference. But listening to that from outside, you say, wow, that person's speaking funny. Well, it's because they've picked up this dialect. So he was looking to see whether the R-less feature of New York City dialect is a regional marker. That is, does it say I'm from New York City or something else? So he looked at hundreds of people and he did 3 kinds of interviews with a set of people that he selected. He selected them based on their level of education, number of years in New York City, but he had a limit of at least 5 years in New York City, gender, economic situation, race. He looked at all these factors, and he did 3 studies. In the first study, he asked people point blank, direct elicitation interview, do you drop your R's? Some people said yes, some people said no. And then he asked, about a month later, he had those same people come in. And this time, he had them read a text out loud. Now, of course, he knew how many R's were in the text. So he had them read on a microphone the same text. Everybody read the same words. And then he was able to go through and count how many people, how many R's did each person pronounce or not. And then about another month later, he brought the same people back. This time he engaged them in casual conversation. And this time he controlled for some of the topics, that they would talk about. But he mainly just tape recorded them in a casual conversation. Then he was able to go back and, transcribe these tapes in order to find out how many R's were pronounced or not pronounced when they could have been. I'll create a new slide for you here to show you how people responded to that. And this style right here shows you some of it, but I'm going to explain this to you better in a new slide coming up. So there were two studies actually that Labov performed to really understand this R-less feature in New York. And the first one was with these three classes. Okay, what he found was that how people responded to whether they drop their R's, and then what happens when they read out loud, and then just in casual conversation, didn't have anything to do statistically with how long they'd lived in New York City, and it didn't have to do with race. What it had to do with was what he then called SES, socioeconomic status, a combination of their level of education and their level of income primarily. So, for example, and I'll be showing it here, in direct elicitation, upper class speakers said, "Do you drop your R's?" They said, "No, I don't drop my R's." Working class people said, "Well, yeah, I'm a New Yorker. Of course I drop my R's." And the lower middle class, of the 6 sort of ranges of class that he looked at, the lower middle class was distinctive. And they said, "Oh no, I don't drop my R's." So they behaved like the upper class. In reading out loud, it was kind of a little bit different. In reading out loud, upper class speakers still dropped quite a few R's, but they dropped the least number of R's of the 3 groups. The working class speakers, true to what they had said in the first interviews, of course dropped a lot of R's, and dropped a lot more R's than people from the upper class when they read out loud. The lower middle class did something very interesting. The lower middle class speakers did what he later called hypercorrection. They tried not to drop their R's. So they behaved more like the upper class, a little less. They dropped a few more R's, but it's like they were trying really hard to show that they were not going to drop their R's. However, in the third round, in the casual conversation, what do you think happened, right? In casual conversation, the upper class dropped more R's than they did in reading out loud, but still they dropped the fewest number of R's. The working class speakers in casual conversation dropped a lot of R's, most of any of the groups for any of the 3 studies. The lower middle class in casual conversation dropped about as many R's as the working class. So isn't that interesting? They hypercorrected in reading out loud to try to approximate the upper group, but in everyday speech, everyday casual conversation, they dropped about as many R's as the working class. Now, to follow up on this and to see that it wasn't just kind of a laboratory set of results, Labov took this into the community to do an ethnographic community study. And it was kind of ingenious what he did. He chose 3 New York City department stores, all within the same borough, all within the same area in New York City. And all 3 of these department stores he checked out had at least 4 floors. Interesting. 4 floors. Notice the R's. So he sent his interviewers into these stores, Klein's, Macy's, and Saks Fifth Avenue, which served different clientele. Klein's is like a Woolworth's level, right? Macy's kind of middle class. Saks Fifth Avenue more, upper class clientele. And he had a hypothesis. If he sent his questioner to go in, his interviewer, to ask, where is something on your 4th floor, he will get answers which do or do not include the R's in 4th floor. So he had them ask it in 2 ways. They found some item located on the 4th floor, like a thimble might be located on the 4th floor. And they would go in and they would actually talk to several different clerks on several different floors of the store, and they would always ask the same 2 questions. First, the experimenter would ask, where are your thimbles? And notice their own R's. They kept their R's. They didn't drop their own R's. Where are your thimbles, please? But they said it pretty casually. Where are your thimbles, please, right? And then, to test the difference between casual speech and emphatic speech, when you really make a special point of saying something clearly, they would follow up by saying, where did you say they are? So where are your thimbles? Where did you say they are? And their hypothesis was that the behavior of the clerks would mirror what they found in their bigger study. So here's what they found. In Klein's, guess what? Most of the clerks drop more R's than not. But in Saks Fifth Avenue, the clerks used R's, both in casual request and in emphatic speech. In Klein's, in casual request, they dropped a lot of the R's, the clerks did. In emphatic speech, they still dropped a lot of R's, but fewer. But in Macy's, isn't this interesting? You find this huge shift between the casual request responses and emphatic speech. When asked, where are your thimbles? The clerks at Macy's first dropped a lot of R's in their answer. They're on the 4th floor, sir, or whatever. They're on the 4th floor. In emphatic speech, after the person said, now where did you say they are? They corrected or hypercorrected for the R's. And now they tended to say, I said on the 4th floor. Isn't that fascinating? So that tiny little cue of dropping or not dropping the R in New York City says something about who you are in terms of your socioeconomic ranking. Now, very, very interesting. Later on, William Labov came across an atlas of New York City dialects written in the 1890s. And guess what he discovered after his study? In the 1890s, Victorian America, Victorian England over here in America, New York City, guess who was dropping their R's? It was the upper class. It was the elite. The upper class dropped their R's to distinguish themselves from everybody else in New York City. It was a sign of elite status to drop your R's in New York City in the 1890s. But once that dropping of the R filtered down to the lower class, and they started dropping their R's too, thinking, well, that's a measure of being a New York City person, that's when the elite stopped dropping their R's. And now they needed to show, that they were educated people, that they weren't the average working class New Yorker. Okay? All right, let's move on. So here's a fun little look at some different tenses in Black vernacular English. There was a big to-do about teaching Ebonics in Riverside in California in the 80s. And it was because English teachers and other teachers in the school systems there, secondary schools, were realizing if African American students are growing up speaking some variety of Black vernacular English, and then they come to the classroom where standard English is being reinforced and rewarded, it makes sense to teach Black vernacular English in terms of its own dialect, rules, and standards first before you teach English in a bilingual education mode. And that's what they've been doing since then. So here you see several different statements, such as she been had that handmade dress, which has a lot of these BVE features in it. And it is a regular tense form in Black vernacular English, as are the rest of these. What we find is that African English, African American English, has some of the same forms in it, like how it inflects or doesn't inflect the to be verb, right, that pidgin languages have all over the world. Isn't that interesting? And that helps us understand that African American English comes from having been a pidgin, which then is taught to the next generations and becomes a Creole. So African American English is a Creolized form of English, but it has its own rules. It has its own structure. And that's why Ebonics is being taught in some schools now to help African American speakers first learn what is the structure of their own home language, and then how do you adapt that to standard. Actually, the first teaching I ever did, I was in Buffalo, New York, getting my master's degree in linguistics, and I taught English 098, English 099, preparatory English. mainly to inner city African American people in Buffalo. And this is before Ebonics had ever even been mentioned or used, but I did find the same thing. If you first teach the dialect, then that makes, without a stigma attached to it, then that makes learning the standard English or any language easier. Okay? So one basic principle in social linguistics, this principle of language stratification, stratification of different dialects and styles, right, is such that some dialects, like the R-less feature in New York City, are stigmatized in society, and some are privileged. If you speak, even to this day, a French dialect in English, or a French accent, we say, of English, that usually is a sign of higher status, right? But African American English is tended to look down upon, or even Spanglish, right? However, you go home to your family, home to your home community, and I want to say this, every dialect or variety of a language that is spoken today is vital and functional for its community. Okay, let's move on. All right, so here's a nice overview chart that I've developed to show how the use of language reflects upon social differences anywhere. Okay. For example, there are two dimensions of how we use language. Language functions in two ways for us socially. On one level, we might use language to raise our social mobility, to get that job, for instance. On another level, in another dimension altogether, we use language to proclaim our identity, especially within the in-group. And these can be quite at odds with each other, right? So I haven't talked about all these different varieties here, but I've talked about a few of them, so let me show you what I mean. In the use of African American English, right, to show your solidarity, your street smarts, or your street language, or your family language, it would be positive for you, solidary for you, to use Black vernacular English at home. And that's true for Native American languages or Indian Englishes, and for dropping your R in a very casual, familiar setting at the workplace, etc. in New York City. So these more informal, casual styles are associated with solidarity. This is who I am, you're my people. On the other hand, in the larger social matrix of things, the standard form of a language, and every language has a standard form, sometimes called the lingua franca, that which is reinforced in business and economics and education, right? That standard form, that lingua franca, right, is the one that tends to be favored and reinforced and rewarded in large-scale society. So here, if you're talking with a lawyer, it would help you to speak some legalese. If you're talking, with a computer person who's fixing your computer, you might want to speak some technical language if you have some, or if you're on a job interview, right, at a computer company. Okay. Here's where we see that hypercorrection that Labov noticed in New York City speech, where the lower middle class tried to behave more like the upper strata, right, to claim a higher level of social status, and maybe for having higher social mobility. Code switching, for example, if you come from Mexico and you speak both Spanish and English, and you intermix them, is what often happens in everyday conversations. And that really shows a kind of a mix then between these two. Depending on who you're talking to, you might speak more Spanish or more English. This elaborated code and restricted code, I haven't talked about too much in this lecture, but it's like this, right? A guy in England did a study. His name was Bernstein, B-E-R-N-S-T-E-I-N, right? And Bernstein found that working class kids in England, if they were describing like a picture, would describe it, let's say, for example, one of his pictures had boys running away in the foreground. And in the background, you see a man running after them. And behind him, you see a broken window. and there's also a baseball mitt on the ground. So you kind of piece together by looking at the picture, the boys have been playing baseball, and one of them accidentally broke the window of this man, and now he's running after them. Working class kids, so Bernstein asked both working class and middle class kids to describe the same pictures. The working class kids would say, like, so they threw it and it broke, and so they're running and he's after them. Lots of very inexplicit language, lots of pronouns, not very many complete sentences, not very great syntax. Very oral communication style rather than literate. Now, the middle class kids instead would describe that same picture by saying things like, so these boys were playing ball. Now, one of these boys threw the ball and it hit the window and it broke the window of this man. And now this man is chasing them because he's angry. Notice how much more of a literate style that is. More complex grammar, more complex syntax, and more like you might read out of a book. So Bernstein had this really interesting notion that this represents two primary kinds of language varieties called codes, restricted code and elaborated. The restricted code is such that working class people generally grow up with, and by the way, anybody might know this restricted code, but those who speak this local vernacular may not have some of the more literate forms by the time they go to school. Whereas middle class or upper class kids, especially because they read, their parents read to them at night, they're much more familiar with literacy by the time they go to school. So now working class kids and middle class kids go to the same classroom, and guess what happens? The teacher says thinks that the people who are from the working class are not as intelligent, they're slow, they don't speak as well, they can't read as well. Whereas the middle class kids even are reading better, they're looked at as more intelligent. Who do you think is going to succeed most at school? Who's going to drop out? A lot of the working kids drop out. So what Bernstein notices, and by the way, Labov has looked at this too, is that there's a mismatch between the home language use and the school. Now, isn't that interesting? So the restricted code is used at home in a solidary way, but you need that elaborated code to have that social mobility. So this is how these things play out. If you look on the left side of the slide, you see these three main terms then. There's linguistic prejudice associated with the stigmatized forms that are at the same time something people are using to show solidarity within their groups. There's linguistic stratification that mirrors the social ranking in society. And there's linguistic anxiety, such as the lower middle class showed in New York City, of people who are afraid if they speak the vernacular, they may be looked down upon or stigmatized. So you see, language is a much more powerful vehicle than you might think of. So you might think, of how you go through your day and how you vary your own use of language during the day and what that indicates and what that says about the groups that you're in, about what the expectations are, and how you feel in those different situations. Thank you. Finally then, for this week, I'm asking you to see this amazing film, We Still Live Here, or Ash Nutayunyan. Now this is about, as I said in the discussion thread, the Wampanoag peoples. These were the Native Americans that brought Thanksgiving to the Pilgrims. And yet, for over 100 years, the Wampanoag language has been virtually extinct, not spoken as a living language. Now the woman shown here on the right, on the jacket cover of the film, is Jessie Little Doe Baird. And in 2011, I think it was, Jessie won, I think it was a $500,000 MacArthur Genius Award for doing something no one in the history of humanity has ever done before, which is to bring back into use a language which had been extinct. She wasn't even a linguist, and until she went to classes at MIT. And by the way, Wampanoag is spoken around Martha's Vineyard, in Massachusetts. She went to MIT because she had been receiving dreams, actually since her teens, with ancient people that showed up speaking a language she had never heard and calling her to bring the language home. Fascinating film. Even if you finish your film report assignments for the semester, I absolutely recommend this film. And remember, if you do all the film reports, I will be giving you some extra points beyond the 6 that were required. I'll have to figure that out. I can't give you 10 points for all the film reports, but I'll give you like at least an extra point for every film beyond the 6 that you do. Now, this film you can stream online, as it says in the module, for I think it's $3.99, and you have to use your Visa card for that. But I have also put it on reserve at the Kramer Library. It's on 4-hour reserve, and I believe there are places in the library where you can view that, so you don't even have to take it home. And the question that I've put for you also follows. So here's what you're going to be thinking about as you watch the film, and I'll have, I think it's the same question or something very close for your film reaction report. So based on looking at this film, what really is a language in relation to culture and in relation to its speaker's way of life, as I've put it here, and cultural outlook? That is, how much does speaking one's native language matter? And I'll tell you right in advance, as a linguist, it matters a lot as far as I'm concerned. And I think when you watch this film, you'll understand why. Okay, I have one more slide and then we'll close for this part 2. So this comes from the founder of the Wampanoag Language Project, Jessie Little-Dobert. So she says, to be able to understand and speak your own language means to see the world as your families did for centuries. In revitalizing a language, you revitalize a cultural outlook. This is important for Native Americans because most Native American languages are endangered today. Because of boarding schools, etc., mainly in the 1800s and since, Native Americans have been encouraged to use English, but at the expense of their own languages, which have been often stigmatized in the process of assimilation to American society. But now many Native American peoples who value sovereignty as independent nations within the United States are trying very hard to reclaim their languages as a process of reclaiming their identity as a culturally distinctive, valuable peoples. So have fun with this film, and I look forward to your responses. Thank you, and we'll move on from here.